The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. For centuries, it had been the most powerful political system the Western world had ever seen. At its height, Rome controlled the Mediterranean basin, much of Europe, and large parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Its roads, aqueducts, and legal institutions shaped daily life for tens of millions of people. Yet by the 5th century, the western half of this empire had ceased to function as a coherent state. Understanding how this happened requires looking beyond dramatic events. The decline of Rome was not the result of a single invasion or a weak emperor. It was a slow process, built from accumulated stresses that weakened the empire's ability to respond to challenges. One of the most significant pressures came from the environment. Evidence suggests that the climate in the Mediterranean region became less stable during the later centuries of the empire. Droughts and irregular rainfall patterns made farming more difficult. Crop yields declined in some regions. Food shortages became more common. A society that depended on steady agricultural production found itself vulnerable to disruption. The relationship between cities and the countryside also shifted in important ways. For centuries, urban centers had been hubs of commerce, administration, and culture. They relied on a steady flow of grain and other supplies from rural areas. But as agricultural productivity became less predictable, this system weakened. Cities struggled to maintain their populations. Public buildings fell into disrepair. Markets that had once thrived grew quiet. The network of exchange that connected the empire began to contract. Infrastructure deteriorated gradually across the provinces. Roads that had once allowed rapid movement of troops and goods became harder to maintain. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Harbors silted up. Aqueducts cracked and leaked. These were not sudden disasters, but the result of declining investment over decades. As maintenance costs rose and available funds shrank, officials made difficult choices about what to preserve and what to abandon at the same time. The empire faced growing economic strain. Maintaining such a vast territory required constant resources. Roads needed repair. Soldiers needed payment. Officials needed salaries. But over time, the tax base that funded these activities began to shrink. Historians point to several causes. Population may have declined in some areas due to disease and instability. Productivity dropped as farmland became less reliable. Networks, which had once moved goods efficiently across the empire, became fragmented. To make up for lost revenue, emperors raised taxes. This created a cycle. Higher taxes strained local economies. People abandoned marginal farmland. Cities shrank as commerce slowed. Fewer people meant less tax revenue, which led to even higher taxes on those who remained. Currency debasement became another sign of stress. To stretch limited resources, emperors reduced the silver content in coins. This allowed them to mint more money in the short term, but it undermined confidence in the currency. Merchants raised prices. Inflation spread. Soldiers and officials sometimes refused debased coins, demanding payment in goods or older, more valuable currency. The monetary system that had facilitated trade across thousands of miles began to break down, forcing many regions back toward localized barter economies. The military system also changed in ways that placed stress on the empire for centuries. Rome had maintained large standing armies on its borders. These armies were expensive. As revenue declined, emperors struggled to pay soldiers reliably. Loyalty became harder to secure. At the same time, the empire increasingly recruited soldiers from groups outside traditional Roman society, including people from beyond the frontier. This was not necessarily a problem in itself, but it reflected a deeper shift. The empire was becoming less able to draw on its own population for defense. Training and discipline within the legions also declined over time. Earlier Roman armies had been known for their strict organization and tactical flexibility, but as financial pressures mounted, training periods shortened, equipment became less standardized. Veterans who might have passed on institutional knowledge retired or deserted. Without adequate replacements, the professional military culture that had once been Rome's strategic advantage gradually eroded. leaving forces that were less cohesive and less effective in complex operations. Administrative complexity grew as well. The empire was divided into smaller provinces to improve control. More officials were appointed. Bureaucracy expanded. But this also meant more opportunities for corruption and inefficiency. Local governors sometimes acted in their own interests rather than the empire's. Communication between the center and the periphery became slower and less reliable. Social structures weakened over time. The gap between wealthy landowners and ordinary farmers widened. Large estates, worked by dependent laborers, became more common. Small, independent farmers, who had once formed the backbone of Roman society, became rarer. This shift reduced social mobility and created rigid hierarchies. It also meant that fewer people had a personal stake in the empire's success. Religious and cultural unity also frayed. Christianity spread throughout the empire during the 4th century, eventually becoming the official religion. This brought new institutions and new forms of authority, but it also created tension. Old traditions were displaced. Regional differences became more pronounced. The shared identity that had once helped bind the empire together became harder. To maintain external pressures increased during the 4th and 5th centuries. Groups from beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers began moving into imperial territory, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. These migrations were often driven by their own environmental and political pressures. Rome's response was inconsistent. Sometimes these groups were integrated as allies. Sometimes they were fought. The empire lacked the resources and coherence. To manage these challenges effectively, none of these factors alone caused the fall of Rome, but together, they created a system under strain. When crises arose, the empire had fewer tools to respond. Armies were harder to pay. Taxes were harder to collect. Loyalty was harder to command. Gradually, the structures that had made Rome powerful eroded. By the mid-5th century. The Western Empire had effectively fragmented. Local strongmen ruled former provinces. The emperors in Italy held little real authority. In 476, the last Western emperor was deposed by a general of mixed Roman and Germanic ancestry. Historians often mark this as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. But the reality is that central authority had already faded years before. The decline of Rome illustrates how civilizations can weaken not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow accumulation of unresolved problems. Environmental stress, economic imbalance, administrative overreach, and social fragmentation combined over generations to erode resilience. The empire did not collapse because of a single failure. It collapsed because many small failures over time made recovery impossible. What remained was not destruction, but transformation into something new.